as Ed said, these are my credentials up there. And, 9/11 is kind of an interesting thing. Just a quick story. I was in Bristol City when 9/11. I was contracted. And we had just got back from a long 7 weeks of travel. I spent 3 weeks with the Marines, or 4 weeks with the Marines, Camp Pendleton, trying to train them on some software. 3 weeks. So we came home, and that Tuesday was our first day back at work. And we take one day off because we'd all flown in overseas. And normal day, I had to train to work, like I did every day out of Woodbridge. About 9:45 or thereabouts, our building shook. We were on Crystal Drive, and our building shook a little. We lived up right over Pentagon. And I will say that my life changed forever that day. I ended up having to go back to war. I had serious tears about that. We ended up going back to war as a contract. Quite an interesting day. Changed a lot of people's lives. So, without further ado, yes, I am an SOB, son of both, and so Johannes Schwab is actually my third great grandfather. Right? Joined the Kniepausen Regiment in 1770. So he was a professional soldier by the time he shipped off to America. Right? Trained for a better part of 6 years, and fought in New York, New Jersey. He was captured in Trenton. Eventually spent about 2 years working for a local farmer in the Lovettsville area. Right. So not only was he getting possession, but he was also paid by this farmer. And that farmer was actually patriot. So they were producing food that was being turned over and sold to the army. It's kind of interesting. So he was exchanged in 1778, and they marched to New York. And British said, "Okay, we're gonna take you guys to Canada, rearm you, refit you up, and bring you back to fight." Even though they exchanged, they were supposed to not fight anymore, but the British had other ideas, right? And lo and behold, there was a storm, and his ship got separated from the other ships, and they got captured by privateers. So they were hauled into Philadelphia because privateers to get their money, right? They wanted their prize money in the ship and everything else. So he spent another 4 years in jail in Philadelphia. So POW MIA days coming up, right? That's pretty close to my heart, right? And to see all that. Sure. Is that a little better?
Yes.
Okay. So John Adam Lebo was a French Huguenot, and of course they were Protestants. And when the Catholics took over the monarchy in France, they kept going further south, and they ended up along the Rhine River, right next to Hessian. And so there were a lot of French and Germans intermarried with each other. So the name is actually Lebeau, right, French. But his father was Peter Lebo, came here in 1737 or so, and Adam was born, and he ended up being a militiaman for 2 months. And that's about as much as I know about him. It was just enough to get into the SAR. What's interesting, his son fought at Baltimore in 1814 when the Star Spangled Banner was written. And then, of course, one of his grandsons, or great-grandsons rather, fought the Civil War. He was actually bayoneted at 5 Forks, and on April 1st of 1865. So I came that close to not be here, right? Great-grandfather was bayoneted in the back, and he put in his pension, and his buddy who's in the company with us, he says, "Hey, I was there when he got bayoneted. I saw the whole thing." He said, and he's complained about rheumatism in his back ever since the war. So you're like, okay. So the Lebos are pretty crazy, right? So my dad his middle name was Lebo. Guess what? He was drafted for World War II. So were his his brother was drafted as well. And of course, I fought in the Gulf War. So it's kind of this lineage of either side of the family. We've been fighting a farm for a long time. But I baled hay one summer, and I said, "The hell with this! I'm staying in the Marines." Way easier than that. Johannes Schwalm Historical Association. We were founded in 1975, and we were motivated by the book Roots, right? So Alex Haley is considered the father of family genealogy. They had a big thing at the National Genealogical Society about him, a big article about how he caused the common man to like look into their ancestors, and that's what motivated us. We had about 6 or 7 different relatives who were working on independently to nail down which Schwab was our Schwab, right? Because John Schwab's a pretty common name, right? So there were several Johannes Schwabs that we had to figure all that out. So they sorted all that out in time for the bicentennial and published our first book in 1976, October. It was written up in the New York Times, and once we put that one book out, everybody came out of the wood with all kind of things, and so everybody wanted to know, like, oh, I'm a German and I have Hessian ancestry. Oh yeah, okay, so let's confirm that. So anybody that can confirm that, we'll sell them a nice Hessian certificate. I'll show you that later. But so we've been publishing ever since, and this year was our 47th year of publishing, and we're already starting to work on next year. If you like to write about Hessians, we'll be glad to see your papers. So what always fascinated me was, how many of us can say that we come from one of the grievances, the Declaration of Independence, right? At this time, he is transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death and desolation and tyranny already begun. And so it's kind of interesting that the writers of the Declaration basically, ahead of a civilized nation would never do this. But what they failed to forget or remember was that this was exactly the same thing that King George II did in the French and Indian War. And the whole term of mercenaries is actually death. And it really comes down to the way the legal definitions of what a mercenary were and what the Hessian units really were. So we'll cover that. And we did mention the Hessian barracks, right? There's some discussion. Was it built for the French and Indian War, or wasn't it? The 2 historians say it was, and others disputed that. I work with people in the county that said, well, we can go in and look at the wood. We can take some of the wood and figure out how old it is, and then we'll know when it was actually built. I think this is actually the second building that was built there. They probably had something there for the French and Indian War, but it was not this building. This was built by the Hessian prisoners, so that they had a place to stay. Kind of interesting place. I've been up there a couple times. So my assertion is the founding fathers were just misinformed. They weren't wrong, they were just misinformed about the nature of these armies that were coming. And first one was that not all troops were from Hessen, right? That's the first thing we'll talk about. The Soldatenhandel, that's a German word for soldier trade. That was a well-established practice. It had been going on since the 1600s in Europe, and it was a way to assist. I don't have enough troops. Let me go rent some. That's really what it was. And so these units were actually requested by a subsidy treaty, and we'll explain what the subsidy treaty basically. It's just a form of payment. I'll go through that. And there were, what came out of the French and Indian War was some legal definitions of who are really auxiliaries and who are really mercenaries. And they wanted to have that legal precedent because auxiliaries need, if they were captured, they need to be treated as prisoners of war. Roman soldiers, mercenaries, on the other hand, they may not have been treated so well. And then there were some individual mercenaries in the war. The United States of America would not exist if it wasn't for the colonial people using mercenaries to help them. And we'll cover that. So this is step number 1, right? There were 6 different provinces that you can see there across the top. Hesse Castle is the one in the middle. It holds the position of honor because most of the troops came from Hesse. You also see the British flag. Well, King George III was actually the elector of Hanover, and Hanover was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, they were all German speaking, but remember, the House of Windsor is really descended from Germans, right? And Queen's dead, long live the king. But we also cover those people. So if somebody can trace their ancestry to a Hanoverian that decided to stay here in North America, we'll do that. This is actually my grandson's certificate. So he too, like me, descends from both sides of the Revolution, and he's got a good German middle name and a good German last name. And Bauer is a German for farmer, and so he's I think I knew a really good farmer politician. I think his name was Abraham. So we'll see where my grandson goes, right? I do know this. I took him to his very first SAR event at James Monroe's monument. Have anybody ever been down there? Beautiful monument. And he said, "Pop G, I don't like that muskets." And so when they fired the muskets. But William Pitt, to get back to the slide, William Pitt was actually Prime Minister of England. And he was complaining about paying these subsidies, these subsidy treaties. Like, why am I doing this? And then it turns out that because he was hiring all these German troops and keep French occupied Europe, it allowed the British to basically take big chunks of that from the French to the French Union. So after he thought about it, he then turned around and became a fan of subsidy treaties, as an example. So here's a map of modern Germany, and you should know it didn't really exist until Frederick or Bismarck, actually, Wilhelm I, actually created unity among all the German states, and that was in the 1870s, 1866. But before that, it was just a series of principalities of the Holy Roman Empire. And you can see there that Hesse-Kassel was one of the larger ones. Hanover was very large, and there were some others here, the Brunswick troops, and the other smaller principalities. And what's interesting about Hesse-Hanau was that was Prince Frederick decided to convert to Catholicism. His wife left him and took his oldest son with him, and they formed the little enclave called Hesse-Hanau. And they did not make up until well after the American Revolution. And Prince Frederick died, his son took over Hesse property. So here's the coat of arms of Hesse, and I like to bring this up. You'll see 1804. Does anybody know 1804, why that would be important? What that really means? Well, anyway, there's this young man named Napoleon. He decided that he didn't want any competition with any other emperors, so he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire after conquering most of it, and got rid of it. So if you go to Germany, take a tour at any of the castles or any of that, they all, this is a very important year, right? Because that was kind of the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Kind of an interesting thing. So out of the 30,000 so troops that came to North America, about 18,000 were Hessians. And the Americans called them all Hessians, and that was just easy for them because they didn't like them. Right? They just didn't like the Hessians. They thought the king wasn't playing fair, that kind of thing. So they lumped them all together. So what's interesting about Hesse, it's right in the middle of Germany, and if any of you were served in the army, you know about the Fulda Gap. The Fulda Gap was that was where the Russians were going to come through and conquer all of Western Europe, right, during the Cold War. And Fulda is just to the south of Hesse, and beautiful farmland there. Like you could go leave here, fly over to Frankfurt, drive up into Hesse, and go, wow, this looks just like Loudoun County, and or Frederick County, Maryland, or Spooky County, Pennsylvania, right? The Germans knew that they saw good farmland. They did it. So, but the problem with being in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire was you were subject to invasion from both east and west. So the French would come from the west, and the Prussians sometimes, and some of the Huns would come from the east. So it put them in a pretty vulnerable position. So when we zoom down into it a little bit, kings or the princes decided, well, we'll put our main fortress at Castle. And that's just that Hessian Castle. And they had a second fortress at Marburg. And Marburg to keep the French at bay, right? Well, they thought, well, what if we have to evacuate Castle? Where do we really go? Because Marburg is too far away. And the same thing with Marburg. If we evacuate Marburg, where do we go? Well, they decided to build a third fortress, and it's in Ziegenheim. And Ziegenheim is sort of about halfway between both of them, and the road network supported it. And it had a river that fed it. And the name of that river was the Schwalm River. And Ziegenheim is known as the water fortress because the moat around Fortress Ziegenheim is fed by the Schwab River. So it's kind of interesting when I go over there, my wife says, hey, everybody can pronounce our name. And which is kind of neat. But it was also the archives. They had originally put the archives there. So even as early as the early 1700s, they realized we needed a place to store all of our records. And so there's a big building inside the fortress today. It's got like 3-foot thick walls. And that was the archive. Really fascinating. They knew they wanted to keep these records. So this is a little model of Fortress Ziegenheim. And so if I had my unmanned vehicle or my helicopter, I could go. And it still exists today. It's a museum. Inside the fortress is the Museum of the Schwab, right? So it's all about the Schwab Valley and all the farming, all the technology, like spinning wheels and all that, the kinds of things that they ate, things of models of kitchens and so on and so forth. But you can see the moat is around there. It's a pretty good picture. The Schwab River is there. You can see it going out both sides. But they had locks and things built that they could actually flood the valley, kind of protect the fortress. But the Germans never did that. So the French actually occupied this for a while, and they felt like they were going to be under attack. So they flooded the valley, and that had all kind of bad consequences, right? Then they couldn't have any movement. They got stuck inside of the fortress, which was not good for them, and they couldn't get resupply. So I think the Germans did that as a drill. So, oh yeah, go ahead, flood the valley. But it was interesting. It was a full service fortress, right? The troops had a barracks. The officers stayed in another barracks. They had a church. You can see the church there in the middle. The church actually had a steeple, and eventually they built a connecting building so that the officers would come to church service, and they would sit up in the balcony. The balcony went all the way around 3 sides. The enlisted men, they were on the bottom too. And it's really fascinating. The pipe organ was up on the 2nd floor, and then the belfry was basically an extension above the pipe organs. So it was kind of interesting. And my cousin basically gave me a tour of that church, and he said, Ross, Johannes would have heard this organ playing, and which was kind of cool, right? She was just telling it to me, right? And but yeah, the organ was put in 1740. So yes, Johannes would have heard it. So you see the archives building there today. That's where on the 2nd floor is where the director of the museum lives on the 2nd floor. The 1st floor is a winery, so they're good to go. They had a huge stable that they built. The French came in and built this huge building with no pillars down the middle, and so that's where they trained their horses during the winter. They trained them indoors. That was kind of neat. And of course, they had a granary. And the grain house was closed as a women's prison several years ago, about 10 years ago. It's still in operation. And the barracks where the troops are, that's actually maximum security prison for the state of Hessian. So that's still an active prison. Kind of fast. And of course, the chow hall is right in the middle. And you can see in front of the church there is the parade plots where the troops learned how to march. So when your last name is Schwalm, they make you climb up to the top of the belfry. And my wife is like, really? And so anyway, we climbed up there, and there's a balcony all around the steeple of the church. you get a whole 360 view of the Schwalm Valley. I took a lot of photos. One was most fascinating was when I took a picture of the parade plots, and this is where Johannes would have learned to do split on the march and do all that kind of other stuff. So it's kind of neat. The Hessians were very organized as soldiers. They had to go, and they modeled themselves after the Prussians, and very disciplined, very professional soldiers. So several back in 1984, one of my predecessors, Mark Schwalm, who was actually the secretary of our organization, he was asked to do a series of 4 lectures to the Pennsylvania chapter of Latins to America. So, for instance, the folks that settled this area they were considered Latins who came from that part of Europe. Anybody that spoke German was considered Latin. Well, anyway, his lectures were put into a book. They captured his lectures, and that was sort of the where we got a lot of our information in terms of the legal precedent behind who does what, who is really, what are these mercenaries, what is it for? And so it was our position that we were actually auxiliaries, that these sessions were auxiliaries to the British Crown. Daniel Krebs is a colleague of ours, and he's been a contributor. He used some of our information. He was a professor of American history at the University of Louisville, and he was doing this while he was still an officer in the German Army. If you know how the German Army works, you turn 18, you can join the Army. Some people are told they're joining the Army, right, because they don't have any other skill. So, and you serve for 12 years. When he was educated, became an officer, German Army. So at the end of that 12 years, between 18 and 30, you can decide, well, I don't want to be in the Army. Yeah, that's fine. You served your time. But others decide they're going to stay, and then they stay in the German Army until they can physically do it. And then they're just basically put on the invalid list. And so he basically ended up resigning his commission from Bundeswehr. But he's a Waldecker descent. His ancestor actually went back to Germany after the American Revolution. And it was kind of interesting. So Daniel's an interesting character. He decided, met a nice young lady in Pennsylvania and married her. And since that time, he's now became a U.S. citizen after giving up his Bundeswehr officer status. But he's teaching at the Army War College. It's supposed to be a 1-year stint, and he's now starting his 3rd year. Interesting. But he wrote this book called The Generous and Merciful. See it there. But it was all about all the Hessians and all the different kind of prison or war kind of things. And so it talks about this soldier trade. He has a whole chapter of this. And it talked about the quality of the soldiers. Well, Rick Atkinson also has dug into this. So in his first book, he kind of made the case for very early in the book that Prime Minister Lord North realized, hey, we're going to need a lot of help. We're going to need Hessians and Hanoverians, could be deployed. So this was early as September of '74 that it came to that. And you got to understand what Britain was dealing with, right? It's the first global empire. I mean, they had people they needed in India, Gibraltar, Canada now had protected it. So they had this massive empire, a lot of islands, and so they always needed help, right? The British Army today is still small, and it's the same thing. So back then, it's kind of interesting. So if you fast forward a little bit to April of 1775, after Lexington and Concord, General Gage led the retreat. And he writes a letter to the Secretary of War telling him, we've now come to the point where we're going to need more help, right? Negroes could enter the cause. How about the Hanoverians or the Hessians? Perhaps the Russians can be hired. And so they set about starting to look around Europe and in the colonies what do we need to do? And Gage estimated he needed about 32,000 troops. And so it's kind of fascinating that about 37,000 actually were brought into the fight. About 30,000 of them actually came of just the German speaking folks. They didn't get any Russians because Catherine the Great decided, no, she knew if she sent her troops to North America, they weren't ever coming back. And she did not want to do that. And so as early as January 76, it started negotiations for this treaties. So how did this soldier trade actually work? It was basically renting military contingents. We're going to give you an amount of money, and you're going to give us an amount of troops, and that's how they were done. They were going to subsidize you for those troops. So the money actually went to the prince. He was supposed to, pay his troops. So this was kind of interesting. That money came from England to Germany, and then they had to figure out how to get the money back to North America. And so they said, well, that's not going to work. So the British would pay them here in America. It was just an accounting. But there was money that went to the various states, and each one of the treaties was slightly different. But generally, it was, they had like a death clause in there, so that if you were killed, your family got a certain amount of money. If you were wounded, you got about a third of that the death would have gone. In other words, you can't come back. So basically, three wounded guys no longer serve, added up to, you got to give us another troop. So the money that equaled that one that would have been killed. So that they had to recruit replacements for anybody that got hurt. Well, this is, how do you know from one battle to the next, right? So they would do an accounting muster at the end of the year. But okay, during the year we lost this many guys. This many were killed. This many were wounded. They can't fight anymore. Let's send them back home. And then they would, when the reports got to Germany, then they would go out and recruit. So the recruits were not, to fill those voids, were not coming until like August, September of the following year. So it's really kind of an interesting lag replacing troops. So why did they want the Hessians? Well, because they were very well trained. As I said, they were well equipped. So it was the prince was responsible to equip, and Frederick refused to have them use any other muskets than the ones that were built at the Prisker armaments factory, Debunking. And Debunking is basically East Germany, right? So the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain came right down through there. Hessen's on one side of it, Debunking is on the other. So the pistol factory was where they got the weapons. And when they finally returned, if those weapons weren't Hessian weapons that they were trying to hand back in, each company was charged for not returning those weapons. Kind of interesting thing that the company lost it, right? And Don Triani, I'll pass this book around. I have it tagged for where the Hessian information starts, in case they look at it. But that's got weapons in there and the kind of equipment. Don, because of his successful art career, he's been able to buy some of these items himself, his artifacts, and paints what they are. And he authorized us to use this one of the Hessian soldier. Kind of interesting. That's what I'm passing around. So, why Germany? Everybody said, why did they get these troops still right, but very good one too. Now, Frederick the Great from Prussia was still recovering from the 7 Years' War, right? And so he didn't send anybody. He refused to send any of his troops and cut a contract with. So here they are. They came. You can see the numbers. Hesse Castile was about 300,000 people. So 16,000, almost 7,000%, according to these numbers. And it was smaller. You can see the numbers much smaller. So what we're currently doing at JSHA is we're starting information environment. We want to cover every regiment that sent here and what have we already published on that regiment, if any, right? And if we haven't published on a regiment, then that's what I'm doing to recruit writers, researchers to go hunt down information we don't have, right? So this is a pretty long-term project. And we, published for 47 years, right? So we're going to be able to take some of this and put it together with new volumes and sell them to folks like yourselves. Like your ancestor came from Unit A. All right, well, here's everything we're publishing. It's a new volume. Sell it to you $50, right? Whatever. So it's kind of fun. As my treasurer says, we're a nonprofit. It doesn't mean we don't make any profit. So there you go. And these numbers at the Trenton barracks, where I got this, are at their museum, very close to what they but you can see by treaty they were only supposed to give 21,000, but in the end they actually provided 15,000 over that, because of the replacements. So it's very, very interesting. So the definition for a auxiliary was set in 1758. This is well before the Revolution, by Vattel. When a sovereign, without taking direct part in a war carried on by another sovereign, merely sends him help in the form of troops or vessels of war, these troops or vessels are called auxiliaries. So that's where the term German auxiliaries comes from. They spoke German. They took orders from their own officers, but they all had to swear an allegiance to King George because he was the sovereign that they were supporting, and so they all swore that before they left Germany. They swore that allegiance. Then they had to Portsmouth, and then transported by the British Navy, to North America, to Canada, or Florida, or crazy, right? Hessian served all over. So it's kind of interesting. Any questions on it? So, there was another legal expert named Wolf, and he came and said aids or auxiliary troops, right? That when you translate the word German, Pulsvolker really means helpers. So this could be any, hey, we need artillery, send you artillery, or hey, we need this kind of infantry, or we need Jaegers, or we need grenadiers. Like most of it. Oh, well, it's good enough just saying just one step down. Skills from grenadiers. So it was, they were considered helpers. Kind of interesting. So they also clarified what a mercenary was, and distinct from auxiliaries. So they made that right up front. These are foreigners who volunteer. So even the Hessians had some mercenaries that they recruited in parts of Europe, brought them into the unit, and then they became auxiliaries. So there is, some evidence of that going on, because once you run out of military age men, you got to go somewhere else to get them. But for the most part, they were whole units of auxiliaries that became. So what I like to do is, I remember the very first history paper I ever wrote in fourth grade was about the Marquis de Lafayette, and I had no idea that I was of a French descendant and German descendant at that point. And my son says to me, Dad, how the heck can you remember what you wrote in fourth grade? I said, well, Lafayette, he was the great. He just impressed me so much. Our little, Pennsylvania history, we learned about Lafayette, right? And he did. He was 19, came, volunteered, said, hey, I'll work for no pay. But he, quite frankly, considered a mercenary. The French admiral, Armand, he was like not quite a privateer, but he was willing to help and train the Navy, right? Work, to convince the French Navy to coordinate actions. Of course, our United States Army would not exist if it wasn't for the Prussian Navy, von Steuben, right? Von Steuben is considered the father of the American Army, and he built the army at Valley Forge, right? Middle of a miserable winter. He took the troops out and trained. They had very little food, very See, the real character of the United States Army was killed, Valley Forge. And in that spring, they went on an offensive, right? And kind of fascinating. Well, Pulaski is another one. He was of Polish descent, and he's the father of American cavalry, right? He came and trained all the horse groups. So you take all these farmers and just ride horses very slowly and plow fields and mules and stuff to taught them how cavalry comes. And then another one is Bartholomew von Hare. He's the father of military police. He was that's what he did, taught the Americans. So it was the Americans that first they needed help, and they became a very studious army. These foreigners come and say, "Hey, you need to read this book." One of the things to read was some of the greatest writings. Of course, that was in German, right? The paper was at a premium, right? That's one of the things that was hard to use. But I went back to we published some on the Hessians of Lovettsville. Ed had done a lot of work on this, and so I wanted to see. Okay, well, let me figure out where they came from. Of the known people from this area, where did they really come from? And it turns out they were from Hesse Castile and Hesse Hanau and Ansbach Beirut, right? So it was kind of interesting. I went to the article that published, and I said, well, let me put it in a chart, right? So here you can see that this is very similar. The Germans that settled here were very similar to West, right? The majority of them came from Hesse. See, one came from Hesse Hanau. Oh no, that. Oh, Pisa. Oh, there he is. Yeah, Pisa. And so they had a small war on spot. So I thought it was interesting. I thought let me chart it out. So it makes sense, right? Most of them came from Hesse. So it was kind of an interesting sidebar. So now I think you have the evidence you need to tell all your friends. No, they weren't mercenaries. Right? No, it's not quite right, and that's kind of fun. And so like I said, it was a standard practice. Most of them came from Hesse, but that's not the only place. And they all had treaties. Every treaty was slightly different. Those legal definitions. I showed you those, and then we know who the guys are that helped make American Army. Right? They were the real mercenaries. So, subject to your questions, we'll counter arguments.
We can't hear you, Ed. We can't hear you, Ed. Okay.
So, other than water, during our So. I didn't recognize you without you calling us. Well,
Hmm. Okay. We can't hear anything here at all. Hello? What happened to the sound? Can you hear me, Ed? Can anybody hear me? Can't hear anything.
I can hear you.
Okay, okay. Okay, let me. The dog in the background. Can, Ed, can you hear me? Anybody? No. Plus, I got questions here. Let's see. Let me try to get in. Okay. Hello, hello. I can hear. You can hear, user? Okay. I don't know who has the mic. Let's see. Okay. Connect that to the mic. Connect that to the mic. Let's see. Do that. Okay, I can't hear anything. Okay. 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 Yeah. I don't know what happened. Yeah, that's mic is on. So we took these switch mics. Why did y'all switch mics? Why are they different? Switch mics. Okay. Hmm. Switch mics.
That's actually not true. That's a legend, yeah. It was changed not during World War I, because there was another post office. So, I don't think this was a- yeah. Okay, I'll talk to Rich. Just say something. Not all the Hessians have stayed here. The early phase, they were at the end of the war, 1783. The British didn't want to pay for all of it to be transported back. So they were willing to make this thing. The Americans, of course, very beginning, they thought they would come here. They would just. It's not the case because they underestimated these professional soldiers. But the interesting thing is both is the Continental Congress and George Washington put the prison barracks in German era. Winchester, Frederick, York, and then as Ross mentioned, they would let the prisoners go to work with local farmers who were Germans. And if somebody they saw how the Germans did here, they wouldn't want to go back. Well, many of them were professionals, they had family, so they didn't want to go back. But said about 6,000 of them stayed here, and they became good citizens. They settled down. And it's interesting on the Lovettsville one that the Abel Barnhouse, one of the family intermarried with the family like the Rowland family, who had two Continental soldiers, who was American Continentals, and two of the sisters married Hessians. So they were sponsors in each other's baptisms. So they got along pretty well. There did not appear to be any long-standing animosity, although in a few cases there was. But for the most part, the former Continental soldiers and former German auxiliaries got along.
Hey, Ed, can you hear me, Ed? Ed? It's Ed here. We have several questions in the chat. Can we? Hello? And we still can't hear anything. Oh. Yeah, no, they have their own microphone. Can you hear me, Ed?
All those things, freedom of religion,
Oh.
right? Like,
Okay.
hey, Holy Roman Empire, we don't really like those guys anyway. We're just going to stay here, start our own churches. So, yeah, that's what they did. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. Oh, it's questions. Question.
Right. Yeah. So the question is, were they volunteers or what was the system? So it was set up just like the Prussians it's called the canton system. And basically each unit, each regiment was told, you can recruit troops in this area. And oh, by the way, you need to get this many troops this year. So was it voluntary? Generally not. Did some guys, want, they didn't really have a decent job, or they wanted to get off the farm, right? Then they would join work. And so if you had a valuable trade in the community, let's say you were a wheelwright, you made wagon wheels, you're more likely, you could have gone either way, right? Hey, we need wheelwrights in the artillery, or we need wheelwrights in logistics training. But how many wheelwrights do you really need? And so, or is it more important for that person to stay? So it had a lot to do with what was your job, what was your, was there anybody else at home that could fill in for you? And again, the way it worked was, so Johannes would go for training, after spring planting, and then they would train over the summer and hopefully not fight a campaign. Everybody fought in the summer. And then when the harvest came, they would go back to the farm. Some of the permanent units that were there, like a third of the unit was always in furlough, always off doing something else, because they had all kind of things they had to do with support, right? I mean, constant maintenance in a unit. And, so depending upon what your skill was, you probably get a furlough. So his younger brother ended up carrying all of it. I'm still friends with that branch of the family. And my cousin Thomas Prince is he's a warrant officer in the German Army, right? Military police, all things. And he just did a back-to-back tours in Poland, handling all these refugees from Ukraine. So he would, and to get to Poland is pretty easy from where he lives in his hometown. Boom, and then off we go. It's kind of interesting. But, his older brother's a reporter, ran for mayor of Schwab, but he didn't win. We couldn't have a victory party, unfortunately. Yes, question.
Wait, excuse me, but we have some questions in the chat here.
Right. Yeah, the stone wall is a really good way to keep the sheep in. And cows are too stupid to get over those walls. But anyway, no, yeah, I mean, they did. They were laborers, right? They would just, they got paid for it. Right? I mean, it wasn't, I had an older German follow me around in Wilhelmshaven, West Germany, right? Back in the Cold War. And, I was like, he's either spying on me or he wants to talk. And so I sat down on a bench and he came up and sat next to me. He said the best thing that ever happened to him, he was a Stuttgart navigator, enlisted guy in Stuttgart, fighter. And he said he got shot down in Italy. He said the best thing that ever happened to us, I got captured by the Americans. And so he ended up in prison camp in Texas. Guess what they did? They harvested wheat, right? In prison, and they paid us. He couldn't believe it, right? They were getting paid to harvest. So yeah, and they did build a lot of, like, wells. They had big wells, barns. I mean, they were the masters of farm. So yeah, all that good stuff.
The Nolan's Ferry, the big warehouse, was supposedly devastated. I don't know if that's
Excuse me, but we have some questions in the chat. Can you all hear me? Hello?
Yeah, generally the Army did it, right? The needs of the service, right? And I have records from Ancestry about the Civil War. And all these guys had red lines through, and several of them is because they didn't have two opposing teeth. So they couldn't bite the powder cartridge to load the musket. So if you didn't have enough teeth, you didn't get it. That was like the only disqualification, not going through. So Hessian's the same way, right? I mean, it's like, okay, Well, we already have 6 field rights, so we're gonna take 1 of them, 2 of them. for this thing. And so it was the recruiters, and they could go and protest and picket, petition, but in the end of the day, the prince needed honor, so they could rent them out, right? So, yes, go ahead. Right, yeah. So a lot of them, started, depended where they were at the end of the war. And in the case of Frederick, right, they all said, okay, yeah, this is pretty cool, but there's already too many of us here. They came across the Potomac and Nolan's Ferry, right? Good thing. They all end up here. So generally they did all the way down through Appalachia. I mean, Shenandoah Valley, right? Those, a lot of German farms down there. And because there were already Germans there, right? A Germantown, Pennsylvania, right? The Battle of Germantown. Settled by Germans. And so a lot of them stayed there. And it depended on their skill, right? If they were clerk or something, they probably would stay in one of the bigger cities. And the laborers, like, have you ever heard of Hers chips? Anybody familiar with Hers chips? Johannes Schwalm worked for Christian Hair, okay? And him and his buddy worked for Christian Hair. So when he finally got rid, deserted in 1782, the jail would put it off, right? Because even the Continentals were having to pay to feed these guys too, right? So it was their best interest to like, hey, get these guys working, And so he went right back out to Mount Etna, Pennsylvania, where Christian Hair has at least land from. Doesn't he get some money, right? Saved up. And he leased 24 acres. Went, farmed that for a few years, started his family, and then said, hey, I heard there's more land further inland in Pennsylvania. So, and what's interesting is their descendants did this huge swath, right? Ohio, New York, Indiana, Illinois, up into Minnesota, Wisconsin, down through the Shenandoah Valley, North Carolina. My sisters, right? My sisters were at a quilt thing, and the quilt meeting was at some church, and they go, hey, Ross, you're not going to believe what we saw. Why? There's some Hessian who started the church and buried right in the middle of the church. So yeah, they went all over the place. Wherever they could get land, right? So as you remember, soldiers were given like 600 acres, right? And a lot of them sold it. They didn't want to farm, so they would sell that. And officers were given more land, right? Cincinnati, right? Cincinnati, Ohio, was settled by a whole bunch of Red War officers. They went to Cincinnati and formed a collective. So you're going to be the boat right, you're going to be the rope maker, you're going to be the barrel maker, whatever. And they went into business. So that's how the city of Cincinnati was created, by a whole bunch of American Revolutionary War officers. They all ran the businesses there down the Ohio River, right?